In 1831, a 61-year-old man lay dying in Berlin, his body ravaged by cholera. He'd spent decades constructing a philosophical system so vast, so ambitious, that it claimed to explain everything. History, art, religion, logic, the human mind itself. And now that mind was shutting down, one synapse at a time. His last coherent words were about a student who'd understood him. Just one. Out of thousands who'd sat through his lectures, only one had truly grasped what he was trying to say. Then Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was gone. But here's what's strange. This man who died thinking he'd failed, who worried his ideas were too dense, too abstract, too German, ended up reshaping Western thought more thoroughly than anyone since Aristotle. Marx built communism on his framework. Existentialists defined themselves against him. Even thinkers who rejected everything he said couldn't escape his vocabulary. He gave us terms we use without knowing their origin: alienation, dialectic, the march of history. And yet most people couldn't tell you a single thing Hegel actually believed. He's famous for being incomprehensible, for writing sentences that seem designed to punish the reader. Philosophy students call him the final boss, the thinker you face after you've mastered everyone else. But that reputation misses something crucial. Hegel wasn't trying to be difficult. He was trying to capture something genuinely difficult. The way reality unfolds through contradiction, the way truth emerges from conflict, the way consciousness itself develops by constantly negating what it thought it knew. Understanding Hegel means understanding how a shy pastor's son from provincial Germany became the man who claimed he'd completed philosophy itself. It means following him from a childhood spent memorizing Latin in a city obsessed with order, through years of poverty and obscurity, to the moment he finally seized the attention of Europe and never let go. This isn't a story about a genius who emerged fully formed. It's about someone who struggled for decades, who wrote in obscurity while younger men became famous, who reinvented himself repeatedly before finding his voice. And that voice, once he found it, would echo through centuries. The city of Stuttgart in 1770 was the kind of place where everything had its proper position. It was the capital of the Duchy of Württemberg, a Protestant stronghold in a region still recovering from religious wars that had ended more than a century earlier. The streets were clean, the buildings were orderly, the church bells rang precisely on time. Into this world of clockwork respectability, on August 27, 1770, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel entered as the first son of a minor civil servant. His father, Georg Ludwig Hegel, worked in the ducal revenue office. Not prestigious work, but steady. The kind of position that allowed a family to live comfortably without ever rising above their station. His mother, Maria Magdalena, came from a family of lawyers and pastors. She was educated. The household ran on discipline and Lutheran piety. Not the fire and brimstone kind, but the methodical, duty-focused variety that emphasized order, hard work, and knowing your place in the divine scheme. Young Georg absorbed these values completely. He was a serious child, the kind who kept notebooks and organized his thoughts. While other boys played, he studied. At age 5, he began attending the German school in Stuttgart. At 8, he transferred to the Latin school, where the curriculum was exactly what you'd expect. Latin grammar drilled until it became automatic. Greek introduced gradually. Biblical texts memorized. The classics of Roman literature studied line by line. It was education as character formation. The goal wasn't creativity or independent thought. It was mastery of an established tradition, absorption of the wisdom of the ancients, preparation for a life of service to church or state. Hegel excelled at it. He had the kind of mind that took pleasure in systematic knowledge, in seeing how pieces fit together. His notebooks from this period still exist, and they're remarkable for their organization. He didn't just take notes. He created elaborate systems of classification, dividing knowledge into categories and subcategories, cross-referencing ideas, building elaborate indexes. At 10 years old, he was already trying to impose order on everything he encountered. But something else was happening beneath the surface of this model student. He was developing a hunger for knowledge that the school curriculum couldn't satisfy. He began reading beyond his assignments. History fascinated him particularly. He devoured accounts of ancient Greece and Rome, not because they were required, but because something in those stories of republics rising and falling, of ideas clashing in public forums, of culture reaching heights and then collapsing spoke to him in a way the dry Latin exercises did not. When he was 13, his mother died. The details are sparse. She fell ill. Within weeks, she was gone. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich was left with a father who grew more distant, more absorbed in his work, and two younger siblings who looked to him for stability. The loss marked him, though he rarely spoke of it. Instead, he withdrew further into his studies as if knowledge could fill the absence. The gymnasium years passed in a blur of academic achievement. He won prizes. He impressed his teachers. He was exactly the kind of student the system was designed to produce. Obedient, diligent, orthodox in his thinking. On the surface, beneath that surface, something else was forming. A restlessness. A sense that the ordered world of Stuttgart, with its hierarchies and its certainties, was perhaps too ordered, too certain. That maybe reality was messier, more contradictory, more alive than the neat categories he'd been taught to impose upon it. But he didn't have the language for that thought yet. He wouldn't for years. At 18, Hegel left Stuttgart for Tübingen, and the world opened in ways he hadn't anticipated. The Tübinger Stift wasn't just a seminary. It was an intellectual pressure cooker where the sons of Württemberg's middle class were trained for careers in the Lutheran Church. The building itself was medieval, a former Augustinian monastery, converted centuries earlier. Students lived in small rooms, attended lectures that began before dawn, and spent their evenings in mandatory study halls. The curriculum was rigorous. Theology, philosophy, classical languages, biblical criticism. The atmosphere was stifling. Rules governed everything. When you woke, when you ate, when you studied, when you slept. Attendance at religious services was compulsory. Deviation from orthodox Lutheran doctrine was punished. The authorities watched constantly for signs of free thinking or political radicalism. And yet somehow, this place became a crucible for our revolution. The reason was simple. When you lock hundreds of intelligent young men in a building and tell them exactly what to think, a certain percentage will start thinking the opposite. Hegel arrived in October 1788, just in time to witness the early tremors of an earthquake about to reshape Europe. A year later, the Bastille fell. News from France trickled into Tübingen slowly at first, then in a flood. A king overthrown, an aristocracy abolished, the rights of man proclaimed. For students trained to accept hierarchy as divinely ordained, it was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Hegel's roommate was Friedrich Hölderlin, a poet whose mind moved in directions that made even radical theologians nervous. Down the hall lived Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, 5 years younger than Hegel, but somehow already further along in dismantling the philosophical foundations they'd been taught. The three became inseparable. They stayed up late talking about Kant, whose critique of pure reason had appeared just 7 years earlier and was still sending shockwaves through German universities. They debated Rousseau, whose vision of natural human freedom seemed to justify everything happening in France. They read Plato together and argued about whether the ancient Greek ideal of the polis, the unified community, could ever be recovered in the modern fragmented world. They also drank. A lot. The Stift's rigid schedule created pressure that needed release, and the local taverns provided it. Hegel earned a reputation as someone who could drink steadily through the night while maintaining perfect logical coherence in argument. Whether that's admirable or concerning probably depends on your relationship with philosophy and alcohol. But here's what matters. In those late-night conversations, Hegel began to develop the ideas that would define his mature work. The sense that reality moves through contradiction, that what appears opposed, thesis and antithesis, actually requires each other and moves toward a higher synthesis, that history isn't random but developmental, moving towards something, even if we can't yet see what. He wasn't alone in this. The entire generation of German thinkers was grappling with similar problems. How do you preserve freedom without descending into chaos? How do you maintain order without crushing the human spirit? How do you reconcile the individual with the community, reason with faith, change with stability? These weren't abstract questions. They were urgent, existential, political. The French Revolution had proven that the old answers didn't work. But what would replace them? The authorities at the Stift watched nervously as their students became more radical. In 1793, Hegel, Hölderlin and Schelling supposedly planted a liberty tree in a meadow outside Tübingen, dancing around it and singing revolutionary songs. The story might be apocryphal, but it captured something true about their state of mind. They believed they were living through the birth of a new world, that the categories of thought themselves were being overturned. That philosophy had to become revolutionary or become irrelevant. Hegel completed his theological studies in 1793. He passed his exams without distinction. His professors noted that he was diligent and knowledgeable, but showed no particular or originality. They couldn't have been more wrong. But Hegel's genius was slow-burning. He needed time, experience, struggle. He needed to see his grand theories collide with reality and shatter and be rebuilt. That process was about to begin, and it would take him to places darker and more desperate than anything he'd imagined in the heady, revolutionary atmosphere of Tübingen. After graduation, Hegel faced a problem that would plague him for the next decade and a half. He needed money, but he had no clear path to earning it. The obvious route for a Stift graduate was ordination, a position as a pastor in some Württemberg village. Steady salary, modest respect, a life of sermons and baptisms and funerals. Everything in Hegel recoiled from it. He'd spent 5 years studying theology and had emerged convinced that traditional Christianity, with its supernatural claims and its emphasis on faith over reason, was intellectually bankrupt. He couldn't in good conscience preach what he no longer believed. But what else could he do? Academic positions were scarce, reserved for men with powerful patrons or family connections. Hegel had neither. So he did what thousands of educated but penniless young men had done before him. He became a house tutor. In the autumn of 1793, he accepted a position with the von Steiger family in Bern, Switzerland. The work was exactly what you'd imagine, teaching the children of a wealthy patrician family. Latin, Greek, mathematics, whatever the parents deemed necessary for a proper education. The pay was adequate, the accommodations comfortable, the intellectual stimulation non-existent. Hegel was miserable. The von Steigers were kind enough, but they inhabited a world utterly foreign to him. They were concerned with social position, with maintaining their place in Bern's rigid hierarchy. Politics to them meant local gossip and jockeying for influence. The revolution convulsing France might as well have been happening on another planet. Meanwhile, Hegel's mind was on fire with questions that had no outlet. He spent his free time, what little of it there was, reading voraciously and taking notes. He began working on what would become his first serious philosophical project, though he didn't know it yet, an attempt to understand the relationship between religion, politics, and human freedom. Why had Christianity, which began as a liberating force, become a tool of oppression? Why did modern European society feel so fragmented, so alienated, compared to the unified culture of ancient Greece? How could political freedom be reconciled with spiritual wholeness? These weren't idle questions. They were attempts to make sense of everything he was witnessing. The terror in France, where revolutionary ideals had curdled into mass executions. The reactions spreading across Europe as monarchies cracked down on dissent. The growing sense that maybe the revolution had failed, that human beings weren't ready for the freedom they'd claimed. 3 years passed in Bern, 3 years of teaching indifferent students, dining with people who bored him, watching from the periphery as history unfolded. He wrote constantly, filling notebooks with fragments that wouldn't be published for another century. But nothing came together, nothing achieved the systematic coherence he was groping toward. In 1796, deliverance came in the form of a letter from Hölderlin. His friend had secured a tutoring position in Frankfurt and could arrange something similar for Hegel. It wasn't much of an improvement, another wealthy family, another set of children to instruct, but it was Frankfurt, a real city with bookshops and intellectual life. More importantly, it meant proximity to Hölderlin, someone he could actually talk to. Hegel accepted immediately. He arrived in Frankfurt in January 1797, and for the first time in years, he felt like he could breathe. The Gogol family, his new employers, were wine merchants, practical people, less concerned with social pretension than the von Steigers had been. The work was easier. The city was alive in ways Bern had never been. And Hölderlin was there, brilliant and increasingly unstable, but still capable of the kind of conversation that made Hegel remember why he'd fallen in love with philosophy in the first place. In Frankfurt, Hegel finally began to find his voice. He continued working on his religious writings, but now they were developing depth, moving beyond criticism towards something constructive. He started to see a pattern in history, the way human consciousness develops by externalizing itself, creating institutions and cultures and religions, then recognizing those creations as its own and transcending them. The way spirit, Geist, moves through stages of development, each one necessary, each one preparing for the next. This was the seed of everything that would come later, but he still couldn't quite articulate it. The system was there, somewhere, just beyond his grasp. He needed one more push, one more crisis, one more confrontation with reality to bring it into focus. That confrontation was coming, and it would arrive on horseback, wearing a French uniform, bringing with it the end of the old world and the violent birth of the new. Napoleon Bonaparte rode into Germany like a thunderstorm made flesh. By October 1806, he'd shattered the Prussian army at Jena, and suddenly everything that had seemed permanent was dissolving. The Holy Roman Empire, that 1,000-year-old ghost, finally vanished. German princes scrambled to make deals with the French. The old order wasn't just changing, it was being annihilated. Hegel watched from Jena, where he'd finally secured a real academic position. Not a tutoring job, not a temporary lectureship, a proper professorship at the university, teaching philosophy to actual students who'd chosen to be there. He was 41 years old. Most philosophers are dead or past their prime by that age. He was just beginning. The position had come through in 1801, thanks largely to Schelling, who'd arrived in Jena the year before and pulled Hegel in after him. They'd been friends since the Tübingen days, though the friendship was already fraying. Schelling had become famous young, publishing brilliant works on nature and art while still in his 20s. Hegel had published almost nothing. The resentment was inevitable, even if neither acknowledged it. But Jena was electric. The university had become the centre of German intellectual life. Fichte had been there until his atheism scandal forced him out. The Schlegel brothers were nearby, leading the Romantic movement. Goethe visited from Weimar. Young minds converged there, hungry for new ideas. Convinced they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented, Hegel threw himself into teaching. His lectures were dense, difficult, sometimes incomprehensible. Students complained that he spoke in half-formed sentences, constantly revising his thoughts midstream, searching for the right formulation. But something was happening in those lectures. The system he'd been groping toward for years was finally taking shape. He started collaborating with Schelling on a journal, the Critical Journal of Philosophy. They wrote manifestos together, attacking their enemies, defending the new idealism against all comers. But tensions emerged. Schelling's philosophy rested on intuition, on immediate insight into the absolute. Hegel was beginning to think this was too easy, too quick. Truth couldn't be achieved in a flash of mystical vision. It had to be worked through, stage by stage, with each moment preserved and transcended in the next. The break came slowly, then all at once. In 1803, Schelling left Jena. Officially, it was for a position elsewhere. Really, they couldn't work together anymore. Hegel's first major book, when it finally appeared, would contain a preface so devastating in its implicit criticism of Schelling that their friendship would never recover. But that book wasn't ready yet. Nothing was ready. Hegel kept teaching, kept writing, kept wrestling with ideas that refused to crystallize. His personal life was a mess. He'd gotten his landlady pregnant. Christiane Burckhardt was a respectable widow, but respectable widows don't have illegitimate children with impoverished philosophers. She gave birth to a son, Ludwig, in February 1807. Hegel acknowledged paternity, paid what he could, but marriage was impossible. He had no money, no prospects, no way to support a family. And then Napoleon arrived. October 13th, 1806, the Battle of Jena. Hegel could hear the cannons from his lodgings. French troops poured into the city. There was looting, chaos, the usual aftermath of conquest. Hegel watched French soldiers march past his window and felt something strange, not fear, not exactly, something closer to awe. He wrote to a friend, "I saw the emperor, this world's soul, riding out of the city on reconnaissance. It is indeed a wonderful sensation to see such an individual, who concentrated here at a single point, astride a horse, reaches out over the world and masters it." The world's soul. Hegel didn't use that phrase carelessly. In his emerging philosophy, the Weltgeist, world spirit, was the force driving history forward. Spirit realized itself through great individuals who embodied the next necessary stage of development. They didn't know what they were doing. Not really. They thought they were pursuing personal ambition, but they were instruments of something larger, vehicles through which history moved forward. Napoleon was destroying the old feudal order, spreading revolutionary principles across Europe whether he meant to or not. The Napoleonic Code was replacing arbitrary aristocratic privilege with rational law. The French conquest was traumatic, violent, but it was also necessary. The old world had to die so the new could be born. Most Germans saw Napoleon as a monster, a tyrant, the enemy. Hegel saw him as the midwife of modernity, but admiration didn't pay rent. The university was collapsing. Students fled. Salaries stopped. Hegel's lodgings were ransacked by French soldiers. His manuscripts were scattered. He scrambled to gather them, terrified that years of work might be lost. One manuscript mattered more than all the others. He'd been working on it for years, writing and rewriting, trying to capture the movement of consciousness, from its simplest forms to its highest expression. He'd finally finished it just before Napoleon arrived. The Phenomenology of Spirit, his first real book, the foundation of everything that would follow. He needed to get it to the publisher immediately. The contract required delivery by October 13th, the exact day of the battle. As cannons boomed in the distance, Hegel wrapped the manuscript carefully and sent it to Bamberg, praying it would arrive intact. It did. Barely. The publisher, furious at the chaos, nearly cancelled the whole project, but Hegel begged. He revised. He added new material, even as the type was being set. The book appeared in 1807, published in sections over several months, because the printer kept running out of paper. Nobody understood it. The Phenomenology is one of the most difficult books ever written. Not difficult like advanced mathematics, where the steps are clear if you have the training. Difficult like a labyrinth where the walls keep shifting. Hegel traces consciousness through stage after stage of development, each one necessary, each one containing the seeds of its own dissolution. We start with sense certainty, the immediate encounter with particular things. This pen, this desk, this moment. But we can't stay there. The moment we try to speak about what we encounter, we're already using universal concepts. This isn't particular. This can refer to anything. So consciousness moves to perception, trying to grasp objects as stable things with properties. But that falls apart too. The object only exists as a unity of properties, but each property leads beyond it to other objects, other contexts. The unity dissolves. Then understanding, where we try to grasp the laws behind appearances. But we realize that those laws are our own constructions, that we're not discovering reality, but constituting it through our categories. And on, self-consciousness emerging, recognizing itself in others, struggling for recognition in the famous master-slave dialectic. Reason developing, spirit unfolding through ethical life, religion, absolute knowing. Every stage is both true and false. True because it captures something real about how consciousness actually works. False because it's incomplete, unstable, destined to collapse into its opposite and be preserved, transcended in a higher synthesis. This is dialectic, not the simple thesis-antithesis-synthesis formula that textbooks attribute to Hegel and that he never actually used. Something stranger and more organic. Each form of consciousness generates its own contradiction, not from outside but from within, and that contradiction drives it forward into a new shape that includes what came before while transforming it utterly. The book was supposed to be an introduction. Hegel planned to follow it with a systematic philosophy covering logic, nature, and spirit. The phenomenology was just meant to show how consciousness arrives at the philosophical standpoint from which that system could begin. But the introduction swallowed everything. It became its own monster, sprawling and digressive, packed with digressions on Greek tragedy, the French Revolution, the nature of forgiveness. Hegel couldn't help himself. Every idea spawned 10 more. Every example opened onto new territories. Reviewers were baffled. Those few who bothered to review it, most ignored it completely. The philosophical world was moving on. Schelling's star was rising. Fichte was still influential. Hegel was an obscure professor in a ruined university in a conquered city, publishing incomprehensible books that nobody wanted to read. He was also broke, completely, desperately broke. The university owed him back salary it couldn't pay. His possessions were gone, looted or sold. He had a child to support, a reputation as a libertine after the scandal with Christiane, and no prospects whatsoever. In 1807 he took a job editing a newspaper in Bamberg. A newspaper. After everything, all the study and teaching and writing, he was reduced to editorial work for a provincial daily. He moved to Bamberg in March, leaving Jana behind, leaving his son with Christiane, stepping away from academic life entirely. The work was soul-crushing. He edited local news, business reports, notices of deaths and marriages. He dealt with censors who scrutinized every word for sedition. Bavaria was allied with Napoleon now, and the government watched carefully for any hint of disloyalty. Hegel, who'd called Napoleon the world's soul, found himself cutting articles that might offend the French. He lasted 18 months. The newspaper job was temporary anyway. The publisher made that clear from the start. By late 1808, Hegel was job hunting again, sending letters to anyone who might help, calling in every favour he could. Salvation came from an unexpected direction. The Bavarian government was reforming its education system, modernising the gymnasiums, the secondary schools that prepared students for university. They needed qualified teachers, people with real philosophical training who could handle the classical curriculum. A position opened in Nuremberg, rector of the Aegidian Gymnasium, the city's main secondary school. It wasn't a university post. It meant teaching teenagers, not training philosophers. But it was stable, salaried, respectable. Hegel accepted immediately. He arrived in Nuremberg in November 1808, 48 years old, starting over again. The school was in chaos. The previous rector had been incompetent. Discipline was non-existent. The curriculum was outdated. The building was falling apart. Hegel threw himself into administration with the same intensity he brought to philosophy. He reorganized the curriculum. He imposed strict discipline. He taught classes himself, mostly logic and ethics, using his own textbooks that he wrote specifically for the students. Those textbooks are fascinating. They're Hegel's system in miniature, stripped down for teenage comprehension, but retaining all the essential moves. He's working through the same problems he'd addressed in the phenomenology, but now he has to make them clear, has to find ways to explain dialectical thinking to 16-year-olds who just want to pass their exams. Teaching forced him to clarify. The system that had sprawled wildly in the phenomenology began to condense to find its proper structure. He started work on what would become the science of logic, his systematic treatment of pure thought, the categories and movements through which reason operates before it encounters any particular content. This is Hegel's most difficult work, even more forbidding than the phenomenology. Pure logic, examined not as formal rules but as a living process, being, nothing, becoming, quality, quantity, measure, essence, appearance, actuality, the concept developing through subjectivity, objectivity, finally achieving the absolute idea. Every term generates its opposite. Every opposite is reconciled in a higher unity. The movement is necessary, not arbitrary. You can't skip steps. Each stage contains all the previous stages transformed. The whole thing builds toward a conclusion that's also a new beginning, the absolute idea recognizing itself as the process of its own self-development. He worked on it for years, often late into the night after his administrative duties were finished. Volume 1 appeared in 1812, Volume 2 in 1813, the final volume in 1816. By then, Hegel had been in Nuremberg for 8 years. Those years also brought personal stability he'd never known. In 1811, he married Marie von Tucher, daughter of a prominent Nuremberg family. She was 20 years younger, well-educated, from the kind of respectable background Hegel had always lacked. Her family had doubts about the match, this older philosopher with his illegitimate son, and his reputation for difficulty. But Marie accepted him, and the marriage was genuinely happy. They had 2 sons together, Karl and Emmanuel. Hegel became a devoted, if somewhat stern father. The household settled into comfortable routines. For the first time in his life, he had something resembling security, but he wanted more. He'd never stopped wanting more. The gymnasium was fine, the marriage was good, the children were a joy. But he was meant for something larger. His books were starting to be noticed. The logic especially, despite its difficulty, was generating serious interest among younger philosophers. People were beginning to understand what he'd been attempting. In 1816, offers started arriving. Universities wanted him. Finally, after decades of struggle, institutions were competing for his services. Erlangen was interested. Heidelberg made an offer. Berlin, the Prussian capital, began making inquiries. Hegel chose Heidelberg. It was a real university, ancient and prestigious. They offered him the chair of philosophy, proper salary, the resources to teach graduate students, and develop his system fully. He accepted in 1816, and by October of that year, he was lecturing again, back in the world he'd been born for. Heidelberg was everything Gina had promised, and failed to deliver. Students flocked to his lectures. Colleagues treated him with respect. He published the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences in 1817, a systematic overview of his entire philosophy, compressing everything into a single volume that could serve as a textbook. But Heidelberg was small, provincial, really, compared to what was happening in Berlin. Prussia had emerged from the Napoleonic Wars, determined to modernize. The University of Berlin, founded in 1810, was being built into the greatest center of learning in Germany. The best minds in every field were being recruited there, and in 1818 they came for Hegel. The Prussian Ministry of Education offered him Fichte's old chair, the most prestigious philosophical position in Germany. The salary was generous, the resources were unlimited. Berlin was the capital of the rising power in Central Europe. He accepted. Of course he accepted. In October 1818, at age 48, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel finally arrived at the center of the world. Berlin in 1818 was electric with ambition. The city had barely 200,000 inhabitants, but it was transforming itself into a modern capital at breakneck speed. New buildings rose along Unter den Linden. The royal palace was being renovated, museums were planned. The university, less than a decade old, was already attracting the most brilliant scholars in Europe. Wilhelm von Humboldt had designed it as a temple to pure research, where professors would pursue knowledge for its own sake, while training the next generation of thinkers. Hegel's inaugural lecture drew a massive crowd. Students packed the hall, faculty members came to size up the new arrival. This was the man everyone was talking about, the philosopher who'd supposedly solved the problems left by Kant, who'd written books so difficult that even other philosophers struggled with them. What would he actually say when forced to speak plainly? He disappointed no one. Standing before that audience, Hegel outlined his vision with surprising clarity. Philosophy wasn't abstract speculation disconnected from life. It was the most practical thing imaginable. It revealed the rational structure underlying everything: history, politics, art, religion, science. Understanding that structure meant understanding reality itself. And Berlin, this new university in this rising capital, would be the place where philosophy finally fulfilled its destiny. The audience was electrified. Here was someone who took ideas seriously, who believed philosophy mattered in the real world. Students began signing up for his courses immediately. Within months, Hegel was the most popular professor at the university. His lectures became legendary, though not for the reasons you might expect. He wasn't a natural performer. He spoke haltingly, often pausing mid-sentence to search for the right word. He'd revise himself constantly, adding qualifications and clarifications until simple statements became labyrinthine. He read from notes written in nearly illegible handwriting, squinting at the pages, losing his place, backtracking to points he'd made 10 minutes earlier. And yet students sat transfixed. There was something compelling about watching this awkward, earnest man wrestle with ideas in real time. You could see his mind working, see him thinking through problems as he spoke. It wasn't polished rhetoric. It was philosophy happening live, raw and unfiltered. The content itself was extraordinary. Hegel offered 4 lecture courses that rotated through the years: logic and metaphysics, philosophy of nature, philosophy of spirit, and history of philosophy. Each course was a complete world. He'd start with the simplest concepts and build systematically toward the most complex, showing how everything connected to everything else. Students who stuck with him for multiple semesters began to see the whole architecture of his system emerging. But he also taught something else. Philosophy of right, his lectures on political and social philosophy, became the most influential course he ever gave. Here, Hegel tackled the big questions about how human beings should organize their collective life. What's the relationship between individual freedom and social order? What makes laws legitimate? What's the role of the state? How does history progress? His answers were complex and often misunderstood. He argued that true freedom wasn't doing whatever you wanted, that was just arbitrary willfulness. Real freedom meant acting rationally, aligning your will with reason, and reason manifested itself in institutions, family, civil society, the state. These weren't external constraints on freedom. They were the very structures through which freedom became actual. The state wasn't the enemy of individual liberty. It was its highest realization. A well-ordered state embodied the rational will of the community. Its laws weren't arbitrary impositions, but expressions of collective reason. To obey such laws wasn't submission, it was self-determination. Critics immediately accused him of glorifying the Prussian state, of providing philosophical justification for authoritarianism. Some of that criticism was fair. Hegel's political philosophy could be read as deeply conservative, defending existing institutions as rational simply because they existed. His famous phrase, "the real is the rational and the rational is the real," seemed to suggest that whatever is must be right. But that wasn't quite what he meant. Hegel distinguished between mere existence and genuine actuality. Not everything that exists is truly actual, only what's rational. What embodies reason's necessary development counts as actual. Institutions that contradict reason are mere appearances, doomed to be swept away by history's dialectical movement. The French Revolution, for all its violence, was necessary because the old regime had become irrational, a hollow shell that history had to shatter. Still, the conservative reading stuck. Hegel became known as the philosopher of the Prussian state, the man who'd reconciled thought and power, who'd shown that what is right because reason made it so. His actual politics were more complicated. He supported constitutional monarchy, not absolute rule. He defended freedom of the press, trial by jury, and representative assemblies. He opposed censorship and arbitrary power. But he also rejected radical democracy, distrusted pure individualism, and believed that social order required strong institutions. He was neither reactionary nor revolutionary. He was something else entirely, a thinker who wanted to preserve what was rational in tradition while allowing history to unfold its necessary transformations. The lectures on philosophy of right were published in 1821 as elements of the philosophy of right. The book was immediately controversial and would remain so for the next 2 centuries. But it established Hegel as more than an abstract metaphysician. He was now a political thinker whose ideas would shape debates about freedom, community, and the state for generations. Berlin suited him perfectly. The university gave him resources and prestige. The city gave him an audience. The Prussian government left him alone to teach and write. His salary was comfortable. His family was settled. His reputation was growing steadily. And he was productive. Between 1818 and his death 13 years later, Hegel published multiple editions of his encyclopedia, expanded and revised to incorporate new developments. He prepared his lecture courses for publication, though most wouldn't appear until after his death. He wrote reviews, essays, and prefaces. He corresponded with philosophers across Europe. He built a school, not just a set of ideas, but a movement. Students came from everywhere to study with him. Some became devoted disciples who'd spend their lives defending and extending his system. Others absorbed what they needed and moved on to develop their own philosophies. The range was remarkable. Conservatives found in Hegel justification for tradition and order. Radicals found a philosophy of revolutionary change. Theologians found sophisticated defenses of Christianity. Atheists found the tools to demolish religion. Everyone found something. This was partly Hegel's genius and partly his curse. His system was comprehensive enough to support multiple interpretations, ambiguous enough that readers could emphasize different elements and reach opposite conclusions, dialectical enough that any position could be presented as a necessary stage in reason's development. The result was that Hegelianism fractured almost immediately into competing schools. Right Hegelians emphasized the conservative, religious, state-affirming elements. Left Hegelians emphasized the revolutionary, secular, critical elements. Both claimed to represent the master's true teachings. Both had textual evidence to support their readings. Hegel himself seemed unbothered by the disagreements. He continued teaching, refining his ideas, engaging with critics. His personal life was stable and happy. Marie managed the household efficiently. His sons were doing well in school. Ludwig, his illegitimate son, had been integrated into the family and was pursuing his own studies. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. But beneath the surface, trouble was brewing. Not for Hegel personally, but for the world he'd tried to understand. The rational order he'd discerned in history, the progressive unfolding of freedom through institutions, was about to face challenges he couldn't have predicted. In July 1830, revolution erupted in Paris. The restored Bourbon monarchy fell in 3 days of street fighting. A constitutional monarchy replaced it, but the revolutionary spirit didn't stop there. Uprisings spread across Europe. Belgium broke away from the Netherlands. Poland rose against Russian rule. Italian states erupted in protest. German intellectuals began demanding constitutional reforms. The old order that Hegel had philosophically reconciled with reason was cracking. Hegel's response was cautious. He wasn't opposed to all change. His philosophy required historical development, but he worried about chaos, about revolutionary movements that destroyed without building, that unleashed forces they couldn't control. The French Revolution had shown where that led, to terror and dictatorship. Better to have orderly reform guided by rational institutions than violent upheaval driven by passion. But the world wasn't listening to philosophers anymore. The revolutions of 1830 were driven by new forces: nationalism, liberalism, socialism, ideas that didn't fit neatly into Hegel's categories. His students were radicalizing. Some were joining revolutionary movements. Others were developing critiques of religion and politics that went far beyond anything Hegel had intended. He didn't live to see where it all led. In the summer of 1831, cholera arrived in Berlin. The disease had been spreading westward from India for years, carried along trade routes, killing millions. It hit Berlin in August. The government tried to contain it, quarantining neighborhoods, restricting movement. Nothing worked. By November, thousands were dead. The university suspended classes. Faculty and students fled the city. Hegel stayed. He had work to finish, lectures to prepare, correspondence to maintain. He wasn't afraid of disease. He'd survived worse. On November 13th, he fell ill. The symptoms came suddenly: stomach cramps, vomiting, fever. Marie called for doctors. They diagnosed cholera immediately. There was nothing they could do. No treatment existed beyond basic care and hope. He deteriorated rapidly. By the evening of November 14th, he was unconscious. He died just after midnight, early on the morning of November 15th, 1831. He was 61 years old. The news spread quickly through Berlin and then across Europe. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, the most influential philosopher of his generation, was dead. Students wept. Colleagues eulogized him. The university held memorial services. The Prussian government issued official condolences. He was buried in the Dorotheenstadt Cemetery next to Fichte, his predecessor in the chair of philosophy. The funeral was attended by thousands: professors, students, government officials, ordinary citizens who'd heard him lecture or read his books. They came to honor a man who'd tried to make sense of everything, who'd believed that reality itself was rational, that history had meaning, that philosophy could reveal truth. But they also came because an era was ending. Hegel had been the last great system builder, the last philosopher to attempt a comprehensive explanation of everything. After him, philosophy would become more specialized, more critical, more modest in its claims. The age of grand metaphysical systems was over, or so it seemed, because Hegel's death didn't end his influence, it multiplied it. Without the master to settle disputes, his students were free to develop his ideas in radically different directions. The school split, fractured, evolved, new interpretations emerged, new applications were discovered. The system that Hegel had built to capture reason's final form became instead a launching point for philosophical revolutions. Within a decade, a young radical named Karl Marx would take Hegel's dialectic and turn it on its head, arguing that material conditions, not ideas, drove history forward. Another student, Ludwig Feuerbach, would use Hegel's own method to critique religion itself, claiming that God was just humanity's alienated self-consciousness projected onto an imaginary being. Søren Kierkegaard would reject the entire system as an evasion of individual existence, replacing Hegelian rationalism with existential choice. But all of them, critics and disciples alike, had to reckon with Hegel. You couldn't do philosophy in the 19th century without taking a position on his system. You either built on it, modified it, or explicitly rejected it, but you couldn't ignore it. The dialectic became a tool for understanding everything. Marx used it to analyze capitalism. Engels used it to explain nature. Lenin used it to justify revolution. Even philosophers who rejected Hegel's idealism borrowed his method, his way of thinking through contradictions, his insistence that truth emerged through conflict and synthesis. The impact reached beyond philosophy. Hegel's ideas infiltrated politics, art, theology, even the natural sciences. Politicians invoked the dialectic to justify their programs. Artists claimed their work represented the spirit of the age. Theologians rewrote Christianity in Hegelian terms, arguing that God himself evolved through history. Scientists borrowed his language to describe evolution and development. By mid-century, Hegelianism had become the dominant intellectual framework in Germany. University chairs were filled with his students, or students of his students. Government positions went to those who could demonstrate proper Hegelian credentials. The Prussian state, which had always been suspicious of radical ideas, now embraced a philosophy that seemed to justify its existence. After all, if history was the progressive realization of freedom, and if the Prussian constitutional monarchy represented the highest political form yet achieved, then opposing the state was opposing history itself. This conservative appropriation of Hegel horrified the young radicals who'd studied his work. They'd read the dialectic as a revolutionary method, a way of showing that existing institutions contained contradictions that would inevitably destroy them. Now that same method was being used to defend those institutions. The battle over Hegel's legacy began before his body was cold. The most explosive reinterpretation came from Marx. He'd arrived at the University of Berlin in 1836, 5 years after Hegel's death, but the master's presence still saturated the place. Marx devoured Hegel's works, joined discussion groups devoted to interpreting the system, and wrote a doctoral dissertation attempting to extend Hegelian ideas. But he grew frustrated with what he saw as the system's fundamental flaw. Hegel had located the engine of history in ideas in the development of spirit or consciousness. Marx insisted this was backwards. Ideas don't drive history, material conditions do. Who owns the means of production? Who controls resources? These questions, not abstract concepts, determine how societies develop. The famous inversion occurred. Hegel had stood on his head, Marx claimed, and needed to be turned right side up. Keep the dialectic, keep the method of understanding through contradictions, keep the belief in historical progress. But replace spirit with matter, philosophy with economics, the idea with the real. The result was historical materialism, and it would reshape the 20th century. Meanwhile, in Denmark, a different kind of revolt was brewing. Søren Kierkegaard had encountered Hegel's philosophy as a student in Copenhagen and reacted with visceral disgust. The system, with its neat categories and logical progressions, seemed to him a betrayal of what it meant to be human. We're not concepts, we're existing individuals, thrown into the world, forced to make choices without certainty, living in anxiety and dread. Hegel's attempt to comprehend everything rationally was for Kierkegaard an attempt to escape from existence itself. He wrote pseudonymously, creating fictional authors who attacked the system from different angles. One would mock its pretensions, another would reveal its ethical inadequacies, a third would insist on the irreducibility of religious faith to philosophical knowledge. The attacks were brilliant, funny, and devastating, but they were also written in Danish and published in small print runs. Few people read them during Kierkegaard's lifetime. His influence would come later in the 20th century, when existentialists discovered his work and recognized a predecessor. In Germany itself, the Hegelian school fragmented. The old Hegelians, mostly professors who'd studied directly with the master, tried to preserve the system intact. They emphasized its conservative elements, its reconciliation of reason and religion, its justification of existing institutions. The young Hegelians, radical students and junior faculty, seized on the critical, revolutionary potential they saw in the dialectic. They used Hegel's own method to attack Christianity, the Prussian state, traditional morality. Ludwig Feuerbach led the charge. His book, The Essence of Christianity, published in 1841, applied Hegelian analysis to religion itself. God, Feuerbach argued, was nothing but human nature, projected outward and worshipped as something external. We created God in our own image, then forgot we'd done so and bowed down before our own creation. Religion was alienation, the separation of humanity from itself. The solution wasn't reform, but abolition. Recognize God as a human invention, reclaim the qualities we'd attributed to him, and become fully human. Marx read Feuerbach and was electrified. Here was the key to understanding not just religion, but all ideology. Humans create systems of ideas that disguise and justify existing power relations, then treat those ideas as eternal truths. Religion, law, morality, philosophy itself. All of it was ideology. All of it served the interests of ruling classes, and all of it could be exposed through proper analysis. But Marx went further. Feuerbach had shown that religion was alienation. Marx argued that religion was merely a symptom. The real alienation was economic. Workers under capitalism were separated from the products of their labour, from their own human essence, from each other. They created value but didn't control it. They worked but remained poor. The system extracted their life activity and turned it into profit for others. Religion was the sigh of the oppressed creature, the opium that dulled the pain of real suffering. To eliminate religious alienation, you had to eliminate its economic foundation. This was Hegel transformed into a weapon. The dialectic became a tool for revolutionary analysis. History was still progressing toward freedom, but freedom wouldn't be achieved through philosophy or constitutional reform. It would come through class struggle, through the overthrow of capitalism, through the workers seizing control of production. The contradictions within capitalism would inevitably destroy it, just as contradictions had destroyed every previous economic system. The revolution was historically necessary. Across the Atlantic, a very different appropriation was occurring. American philosophers, isolated from European debates and focused on practical concerns, encountered Hegel through British intermediaries. What emerged was a strange hybrid called absolute idealism, which combined Hegelian metaphysics with British empiricism and American pragmatism. Josiah Royce at Harvard became the leading American Hegelian, developing a system that preserved the absolute while grounding it in experience and community. But the real American engagement with Hegel came through the movement that would eventually be called pragmatism. William James, John Dewey and Charles Sanders Peirce all read Hegel, all rejected his system as too abstract and rigid. but all borrowed his emphasis on process development and the social nature of knowledge. Dewey in particular absorbed the dialectical method, using it to analyse education, democracy and social reform. Ideas weren't eternal truths, but tools for solving problems. Knowledge wasn't contemplation, but active engagement with the world. Philosophy's job wasn't to discover reality, but to improve it. Back in Europe, Hegel's influence penetrated British philosophy through a group known as the British Idealists. T.H. Green, F.H. Bradley, and Bernard Bosanquet imported Hegelian ideas into a tradition that had been dominated by empiricism since Locke. They argued that reality was ultimately mental or spiritual, that individuals couldn't be understood apart from their social context, that freedom required participation in a rational community. These weren't just academic positions, they had political implications. The British idealists helped justify the expansion of state power, the development of social welfare programs, the idea that government had positive obligations to promote citizen welfare. In France, Hegel arrived late but made an enormous impact. A series of lectures by Alexandre Kojève in the 1930s introduced a generation of French intellectuals to Hegelian thought. Jean-Paul Sartre, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Jacques Lacan, and many others attended. They heard Hegel interpreted through Marx and Heidegger, filtered through the catastrophe of World War I and the rise of totalitarianism. What emerged was a reading focused on struggle, recognition, the master-slave dialectic, and the violence inherent in historical development. This French Hegel would influence existentialism, phenomenology, structuralism, and post-structuralism. Sartre's analysis of being and nothingness owed everything to the dialectic. Lacan's theory of subject formation borrowed Hegelian recognition. Even critics like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, who rejected systematic philosophy, remained in dialogue with Hegel's ghost. You couldn't escape him. Every attempt to move beyond Hegel turned out to be another Hegelian negation, another moment in the dialectic. The 20th century saw Hegelianism evolve in even stranger directions. Italian fascists claimed Hegel as an intellectual ancestor, pointing to his emphasis on the state and his critique of individualism. Soviet communists made dialectical materialism official doctrine, turning Hegel's method into a rigid orthodoxy enforced by political power. Nazi philosophers rejected Hegel as too cosmopolitan, too rational, insufficiently rooted in blood and soil. Everyone wanted to claim him or denounce him, but nobody could ignore him. Meanwhile, analytic philosophy, the dominant movement in English-speaking universities after World War II, defined itself partly in opposition to Hegelian system building. Bertrand Russell and G.A. Moore had launched their careers by attacking British idealism. Ludwig Wittgenstein dismissed metaphysics as confusion about language. The logical positivists declared most philosophy meaningless. Hegel became a symbol of everything wrong with traditional philosophy, obscure, pretentious, disconnected from science, making claims that couldn't be verified or falsified. But even here, Hegel's influence persisted in unexpected ways. Wilfrid Sellars, one of the most important analytic philosophers of the mid-20th century, openly acknowledged his debt to Hegelian ideas. His critique of the given, his insistence that all knowledge is mediated by concepts, his emphasis on the social nature of rationality. These were Hegelian themes translated into analytic idiom. Robert Brandom later made the connection explicit, developing a systematic reading of Hegel that resonated with contemporary analytic concerns. The strangest resurrection came in the 1960s, when Hegel suddenly became relevant to understanding global politics. Alexandre Kojève had argued in those famous Paris lectures that history ended with the French Revolution and Napoleon. The principle of universal recognition, the idea that every human being deserves equal respect and rights, had been discovered. All subsequent history was just working out the implications. The basic question was settled. This interpretation lay dormant for decades until Francis Fukuyama revived it after the Cold War ended. His essay and later book, The End of History and the Last Man, argued that liberal democracy represented the final form of human government. Not because it was perfect, but because it resolved the fundamental contradictions that had driven historical development. The struggle for recognition, the conflict between masters and slaves, the tension between individual freedom and collective identity. All of this found its solution in democratic capitalism. History, in the Hegelian sense, was over. The claim provoked outrage, mockery, and serious debate. Critics pointed to ongoing conflicts, rising authoritarianism, the persistence of poverty and inequality. How could anyone claim history had ended while wars raged and injustices multiplied? But Fukuyama, like Kojèva before him, wasn't making an empirical claim about current events. He was making a philosophical claim about the exhaustion of fundamental alternatives. Liberal democracy might be flawed, might be poorly implemented, might face challenges, but what rival system offered a superior solution to the basic problems of political organization? The debate continues. China's rise, the return of nationalism, the crisis of liberalism itself. All of these challenge the end of history thesis, but the very terms of the debate, the framework through which we understand historical development, remain Hegelian. We still think about progress, about contradictions driving change, about the movement toward greater freedom and recognition. We've absorbed the dialectic so thoroughly that we don't realize we're using it. Today, Hegel's reputation among professional philosophers is complex. Few would call themselves Hegelians without qualification. The grand system, with its logical necessity and its comprehensive scope, strikes most contemporary thinkers as implausible. We're too aware of contingency, too skeptical of totality, too suspicious of systems that claim to explain everything. The 20th century taught us to be modest in our philosophical ambitions, yet Hegel refuses to disappear. New interpretations continue to emerge. Scholars argue about what he really meant, how his obscure passages should be read, whether his system can be salvaged or should be abandoned. The secondary literature grows exponentially. University courses on Hegel remain packed. His books continue to be translated, annotated, debated. 2 centuries after his death, he's still a living presence in philosophy. Part of this is simply historical importance. You can't understand modern thought without understanding Hegel. Marx, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dewey, Heidegger, Sartre. Everyone was responding to him, working through him, trying to escape his shadow. To study philosophy is to study Hegel's influence, whether you like it or not. But there's something more. Hegel asked questions that remain urgent. How do we make sense of historical change? How do individual actions relate to large-scale social transformations? How does consciousness relate to the material world? How do we reconcile freedom with necessity, particularity with universality, individual identity with social belonging? These aren't antiquarian puzzles. They're the questions we still struggle with when we try to understand our world. And his method, the dialectic itself, remains a powerful tool for thinking through contradictions. Not because it delivers certain truth, not because it reveals absolute knowledge, but because it forces us to take seriously the tensions and conflicts that structure our experience. Progress comes through struggle. Understanding emerges through confronting opposition. Truth develops rather than being simply discovered. These insights survive even when the system that produced them has been abandoned. The encounter with Hegel is transformative in a way that few philosophical educations are. Most thinkers can be read, understood, filed away. Hegel demands something different. He changes how you think. Once you've worked through the phenomenology or the logic, you can't return to seeing the world in simple static categories. Everything becomes process, development, contradiction, working itself out. The table in front of you isn't just a table, it's the crystallization of human labour, the product of historical development embedded in networks of social relations. The seemingly solid dissolves into movement. This is both exhilarating and exhausting. It's exhilarating because it makes everything, philosophically, alive. There are no neutral facts, no bare objects, no experiences that don't carry layers of meaning and history. The world becomes richer, more complex, more interesting. But it's exhausting because you can never rest in simplicity again. Every answer generates new questions. Every resolution reveals new contradictions. The dialectic never stops. Some people embrace this completely, becoming what critics call Hegel drunk. They see dialectics everywhere, find contradictions in every situation, invoke the Aufhebung at every turn. The world becomes a vast Hegelian theatre where every event is a moment in spirit's self-realization. This can become its own form of dogmatism, a new certainty as rigid as anything Hegel criticized. Others reject him entirely, arguing that the whole system is an elaborate fraud. The obscurity isn't depth but confusion. The contradictions aren't profound but incoherent. The grand narrative is wishful thinking masquerading as philosophy. Better to start fresh, they say, to think clearly about specific problems rather than constructing metaphysical systems. Both responses miss something essential. Hegel's value isn't in his system, but in his questions and his method. You don't have to accept the absolute idea to find the dialectic useful. You don't have to believe in spirit's teleological unfolding to recognize that contradictions drive change. You don't have to embrace the whole to learn from the parts. Consider his analysis of recognition. Strip away the metaphysical apparatus, the language about consciousness and spirit. What remains is a profound insight about human psychology and social life. We become who we are through our relationships with others. Identity isn't something we possess in isolation, but something we achieve through mutual acknowledgement. This works even if you reject everything else in the system, or take his understanding of freedom. Not freedom as mere absence of constraint, but freedom as self-determination, as living according to laws we've given ourselves. This enriches political philosophy whether or not you accept Hegel's account of how history realizes freedom. The method itself, thinking through contradictions rather than avoiding them, remains valuable. When faced with opposing claims, the usual move is to pick one and argue against the other. Hegel taught us to ask whether the opposition itself might be false, whether both sides might be partially right, whether a higher synthesis might preserve what's true in each while transcending their one-sidedness. This doesn't always work. Sometimes contradictions are genuine, and one side simply is right. But often enough, the dialectical approach reveals possibilities that binary thinking misses. It's a tool, not a religion. The influence on political thought deserves special attention, because this is where Hegel remains most controversial and most vital. His political philosophy, laid out most completely in the Elements of the Philosophy of Right, published in 1820, represents his attempt to think through what a rational state would look like. Critics have read this book as a defense of the Prussian status quo, a betrayal of the revolutionary spirit of his youth. The state, Hegel argues, is the actualization of freedom. Not just any state, but a properly organized rational state that recognizes individual rights while binding citizens together in shared institutions. The family provides immediate ethical life. Civil society, the realm of economic activity and particular interests, develops individual autonomy. The state synthesizes these, creating a community where individuals are both free and united. This sounds abstract, but Hegel had concrete proposals. He supported constitutional monarchy, not absolute rule. He defended trial by jury, freedom of the press within limits, and property rights. He argued for corporations and estates that would mediate between individuals and the state, preventing both atomization and tyranny. The system he described wasn't radical, but it wasn't simply conservative either. It was reformist, seeking to preserve what worked while gradually improving institutions. The problem is the tone. Hegel writes about the state with reverence, calling it the march of God through the world, describing it as the actuality of the ethical idea. This language makes modern readers uncomfortable. We've seen what states do when they claim divine sanction. We know how appeals to higher unity can crush individual rights. The 20th century taught us to be suspicious when philosophers glorify the state. Yet we should be careful about reading 20th century horrors back into 19th century philosophy. Hegel wasn't advocating totalitarianism. He was trying to think through how individual freedom and social solidarity could be reconciled. His answer, a constitutional state with robust civil society institutions, isn't obviously wrong. The real question is whether he got the balance right, whether his concern for unity compromised his commitment to freedom. Different readers answer differently. The Marxist tradition seized on Hegel's insights about contradiction and development, while rejecting his political conclusions. If history moves through class struggle, if consciousness is shaped by material conditions, then the rational state Hegel described was ideology disguising exploitation. The dialectic becomes a tool for critique rather than justification. Marx famously said he found Hegel standing on his head and turned him right side up. The liberal tradition took the opposite lesson. Hegel's emphasis on institutions, on the state as the framework for individual freedom, influenced progressive reformers who sought to strengthen democratic governance while protecting rights. The administrative state, regulatory agencies, the welfare system. These can be seen as attempts to realize something like Hegel's vision of a rational state mediating between individual and community. The conservative tradition found in Hegel a defense of tradition, authority, and organic community against revolutionary upheaval. Edmund Burke meets German idealism. The state isn't a machine we can redesign at will, but a living organism that develops historically. Radical change tears the social fabric. Reform must respect inherited institutions. All three readings find something in Hegel which tells you both about his richness and his ambiguity. He provides resources for multiple political projects. This isn't necessarily a virtue. Philosophy should clarify, not obscure. But it does mean that Hegel remains politically relevant in ways that most philosophers don't. The question of how to balance freedom and solidarity, individual rights and social belonging, hasn't been resolved. We're still working through the tension Hegel identified. Contemporary political philosophy continues to grapple with distinctly Hegelian problems. Communitarians like Charles Taylor and Michael Sandel argue against liberal individualism using recognizably Hegelian themes. Identity is social. Freedom requires community. Rights need context. We can't understand ourselves as isolated atoms contracting with strangers. We're embedded in networks of recognition and shared meaning. Their liberal opponents, philosophers like John Rawls and Ronald Dworkin, push back, but even they often work within a framework Hegel established. Rawls's concern for stability, for overlapping consensus, for institutions that can endure while respecting pluralism. These are Hegelian concerns, even if Rawls reaches different conclusions. The debate about multiculturalism and recognition owes much to Hegel as filtered through Taylor. Different groups seeking acknowledgement of their distinct identities, demanding that their particular cultures be respected within a universal framework of rights. This is the struggle for recognition playing out in contemporary politics. Hegel didn't foresee these specific conflicts, but he gave us the conceptual tools to understand them. The same applies to debates about economic justice. Is capitalism rational? Does it actualize freedom or undermine it? Hegel argued that civil society, the market economy, develops individual autonomy while generating its own contradictions. Wealth and poverty both increase. The system produces a rabble, an underclass excluded from participation. He had no solution to this, just the observation that civil society can't resolve its own contradictions internally. That sounds remarkably contemporary. The inequality, the precarity, the sense that economic freedom for some means economic domination of others. We're still trying to work out whether and how markets can be reconciled with genuine freedom for all. Hegel identified the problem without solving it, which makes him both frustrating and valuable. His philosophy of history remains perhaps his most controversial legacy, the idea that history has direction, that it's moving toward greater freedom and rationality, that Europe represents the culmination of this development. This can sound dangerously Eurocentric, teleological, even racist. Hegel did write appallingly about non-European peoples, describing Africa as the land of childhood, claiming that Africans had no history. These passages are indefensible. They reflect the prejudices of his time, but that doesn't excuse them. Philosophy should transcend its historical moment, should reach toward truth rather than reflecting contingent biases. Yet we can separate the general framework from the specific content. The idea that history has direction doesn't require believing that Europe is superior. The idea that freedom expands over time doesn't require dismissing non-Western cultures. The dialectic of recognition doesn't belong exclusively to European development. Scholars have worked to extract what's valuable in Hegel's historical vision while rejecting its Eurocentric elements. History does seem to exhibit patterns. Institutions do develop. Forms of social organization do succeed each other. Whether this amounts to progress is debatable, but that something changes in identifiable ways is harder to deny. The challenge is understanding historical development without imposing false necessity, without pretending that what happened had to happen, without turning history into a story with ourselves as the inevitable heroes. Hegel's method encourages this temptation. If every stage is necessary, if contradictions must be resolved in specific ways, then the present becomes justified by the past. Whatever is rational. This can become conservative in the worst sense, accepting injustice because it supposedly serves some larger purpose. But the method doesn't require this conclusion. You can think dialectically about historical development while remaining open to contingency, while recognizing that things could have been different, while judging the present critically rather than affirming it. The tool is useful even when the specific application is flawed. What makes Hegel permanently valuable isn't his system, but his sensibility. He taught us to see development where others saw stasis, to find meaning in contradiction, to understand that apparent opposites might be moments of a larger process. This applies beyond philosophy. Scientists thinking about evolution, about systems that develop through time, about emergence and self-organization. They're working in a post-Hegelian conceptual space, whether they know it or not. Artists exploring how forms negate and transform themselves, how traditions develop through creative destruction, how the new emerges from the old. That's dialectical thinking. Psychologists studying how identity forms through internalization and projection, how we become ourselves through others. Hegel was there first. Not that he discovered these processes. They existed before he described them. But he gave us the concepts to think them through, to understand development and contradiction as fundamental rather than accidental features of reality. That's what great philosophy does. It doesn't solve every problem or answer every question. It gives us new ways to think, new tools for understanding, new questions to ask. Hegel did this more comprehensively than almost anyone. After Hegel, philosophy couldn't return to static categories, to simple oppositions, to the pretense that truth is just sitting there, waiting to be discovered. Everything became historical, developmental, caught up in processes larger than itself. This was genuinely new. The personal tragedy of Hegel's final years adds poignancy to his intellectual legacy. In the summer of 1831, a cholera epidemic swept through Europe. It reached Berlin in August. The disease spread rapidly through the crowded, unsanitary city. Thousands fell ill. Hundreds died. The university closed. Those who could fled to the countryside. Hegel stayed in Berlin. He believed the danger was exaggerated, or perhaps he simply refused to abandon his post. He continued his daily routine, attending to university business, corresponding with colleagues, working on revisions to his encyclopedia. In late August, he began feeling unwell. Stomach pains, nausea, weakness. The symptoms might have been cholera, or they might have been something else. The diagnosis was never entirely clear. By mid-September, he seemed to recover. He resumed his normal activities, even gave a few lectures. Then on November 13th, the illness returned with sudden violence. Within hours, he was dead. He was 61 years old. The official cause of death was listed as cholera, though some physicians suspected it was actually a stomach ailment. The distinction hardly matters. What matters is the abruptness. One day the most famous philosopher in Germany, the next day gone. No time for final words, no deathbed scene, no opportunity to tie up loose ends. The system he'd spent his life constructing remained incomplete. The final volume of his lectures on the philosophy of religion was still in draft form. Notes for revised editions of his major works sat unfinished on his desk. The great synthesis ended mid-thought. His students mourned. His colleagues wrote tributes. The king sent condolences. Hegel was buried in Berlin's Dorotheenstadt cemetery, not far from the grave of Johann Gottlieb Fichte, the philosopher whose work had influenced his early development. The funeral was attended by hundreds. Within weeks, plans were underway for a collected edition of his works. His disciples would spend years editing his lecture notes, preparing them for publication, ensuring that the system would survive its creator. But even as the monuments were being erected, the criticism was beginning. Hegel had dominated German philosophy for 2 decades. Now the reaction set in. Younger thinkers who'd grown up in his shadow were eager to escape it. The system that had seemed comprehensive began to look constraining. The method that had promised to explain everything started to feel like it explained nothing. The attack came from multiple directions. Some rejected the entire approach. Others accepted the method but disputed the conclusions. Still others claimed to be fulfilling Hegel's project by taking it in directions he'd never intended. This last group called themselves Young Hegelians, and they would reshape 19th century thought. The division emerged almost immediately after Hegel's death. There were old Hegelians who defended the system as Hegel had left it, and young Hegelians who insisted that Hegel's method pointed beyond his own conclusions. The split centered on religion. Hegel had claimed that philosophy and Christianity expressed the same truth in different forms. The young Hegelians said this was cowardice. If philosophy is higher than religion, if concepts are truer than representations, then philosophy should replace religion, not accommodate it. Ludwig Feuerbach struck first. In 1841, he published The Essence of Christianity, arguing that God is simply humanity projected outward, that theology is really anthropology in disguise. Everything we say about God is actually something we should say about ourselves. Divinity is human nature, idealized. Religion alienates us from our own essence by attributing it to an imaginary being. This was explosive. Feuerbach was using Hegelian concepts, the idea that consciousness develops through alienation and return, but directing them against religion itself. Hegel had preserved Christianity by translating it into philosophy. Feuerbach demolished it by showing that the translation revealed religion's emptiness. There's no God out there. There's only humanity trying to understand itself. The radicalism accelerated. Bruno Bauer applied Hegelian criticism to the New Testament itself, treating the Gospels as historical documents rather than divine revelation. He argued that Christianity was a human creation, that Jesus might not have existed, that the entire edifice of faith rested on fabrications. This got him fired from his teaching position. The Prussian authorities had tolerated Hegel's abstract reconciliation of philosophy and Christianity. They wouldn't tolerate direct attacks on scripture. But the most important young Hegelian wasn't primarily concerned with religion. Karl Marx had been a student in Berlin just after Hegel's death, absorbing the method, participating in the young Hegelian circle. He accepted the dialectical approach, then he turned it on its head. Hegel, Marx argued, had gotten things backwards. Consciousness doesn't determine life. Life determines consciousness. Ideas don't drive history. Material conditions do. The development of human society isn't the self-unfolding of spirit, but the result of how people produce their means of subsistence, how they organize labor, how they distribute resources. Change the economic base, and the ideological superstructure changes with it. This inversion was profound. Hegel had made thought primary and matter derivative. Marx reversed the priority. Philosophy becomes a reflection of material conditions rather than their driver. The contradictions that propel history aren't conceptual, but social, rooted in class conflict, in the struggle between those who own the means of production and those who must sell their labor to survive. Marx kept the dialectical method, the focus on contradiction and development, the idea that history moves through stages. But he relocated the engine of change from the realm of ideas to the realm of economics. The bourgeoisie emerges from feudalism through contradiction. Capitalism develops its own internal contradictions. The proletariat will eventually negate the system that created it. Revolution becomes the political equivalent of dialectical negation. Whether Marx correctly applied Hegel's method is debatable. Whether his economic analysis was accurate is debatable. What's not debatable is the influence. Marxism became one of the most powerful intellectual and political forces of the 19th and 20th centuries. It shaped revolutions, built empires, transformed entire societies, and it emerged directly from wrestling with Hegel's philosophy, from accepting the dialectical framework while rejecting its idealist foundation. Søren Kierkegaard attacked from a different angle. He'd read Hegel carefully, understood the system, and decided it was precisely the problem. The system explains everything in general and nothing in particular. It accounts for humanity but ignores the individual. It describes universal structures but misses the lived experience of existing as a specific person facing specific choices. For Kierkegaard, Hegel's worst error was treating existence as something that could be comprehended rationally. Life isn't a concept to be understood, but a reality to be lived. The most important questions, how should I live? What should I believe? How do I face death? Can't be answered through systematic philosophy. They require decision, commitment, risk. Philosophy that tries to remove risk, that pretends to give you certainty, is fundamentally dishonest. This was existentialism before the term existed. Kierkegaard insisted on the irreducibility of individual experience, on the anxiety of freedom, on the necessity of choosing without guarantees. He wrote under pseudonyms, used indirect communication, deliberately avoided system building. Everything he did was designed to counter Hegel's approach. Meanwhile, in Britain and America, different criticisms were developing. The empiricist tradition had never been comfortable with German idealism. British philosophers found Hegel's abstractions baffling and his conclusions unverifiable. How do you test whether spirit is actualizing itself through history? What evidence would count for or against the claim that contradictions drive development? John Stuart Mill dismissed Hegelian philosophy as mysticism dressed up in technical language. He wanted philosophy grounded in observation, in clear thinking about what we can actually experience. The dialectic seemed to him like word games, elaborate structures built on nothing solid. American pragmatists like William James and John Dewey were more sympathetic but still skeptical. They appreciated Hegel's emphasis on process and development, but rejected his absolutism, his claim to final truth. Philosophy should be experimental, provisional, responsive to experience. Systems that claim to explain everything usually explain nothing. Yet even the critics absorbed Hegelian insights. Marx, despite inverting Hegel, remained deeply dialectical. Kierkegaard, despite rejecting the system, accepted that consciousness develops through stages, that understanding emerges from living through contradictions. The British idealists of the late 19th century, figures like T.H. Green and F.H. Bradley, brought Hegelian concepts into Anglo-American philosophy despite empiricist resistance. The pattern repeated across disciplines. Hegel's specific conclusions were often rejected. His method kept reappearing. Sociologists thinking about how institutions develop, psychologists studying consciousness, political theorists analysing the state, all found themselves working with concepts Hegel had articulated. The 20th century brought new waves of engagement. Phenomenology, particularly as developed by Hegel scholar Alexandre Kojève, made Hegelian recognition central to understanding human existence. Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, despite its opposition to systematic philosophy, employed dialectical structures when analysing consciousness and freedom. The Frankfurt School, attempting to combine Marx and Freud, grounded their critical theory in Hegelian Marxist foundations. Even analytic philosophy, which defined itself partly in opposition to idealism, couldn't escape entirely. When Wilfrid Sellars talked about the space of reasons, when Robert Brandom developed inferentialist semantics, when John McDowell discussed spontaneity and receptivity, they were engaging with problems Hegel had identified, using tools he'd developed, even when they rejected his conclusions. The revival intensified in the late 20th century. Scholars began reading Hegel more carefully, recognizing that many criticisms were based on caricatures. He wasn't claiming that history ended in 1806. He wasn't justifying the Prussian state uncritically. He wasn't denying the reality of the external world. Close reading revealed a more sophisticated, more defensible philosopher than the straw man his critics had attacked. This rehabilitation came with caveats. Nobody wanted to return to the full system. The Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, with its deduction of nature from logic, remained implausible. The philosophy of nature, with its attempt to derive empirical facts from concepts, couldn't survive confrontation with actual science. The system as a total package was dead, but the parts lived on. The phenomenology remained compelling as a description of how consciousness develops through error and correction. The logic offered resources for thinking about concepts, inference, and truth. The philosophy of right provided frameworks for analysing social institutions. The lectures on aesthetics and the philosophy of history continued to influence their respective fields. What survived most powerfully was the sensibility, thinking dialectically about processes and contradictions, refusing to accept simple oppositions as final, looking for how apparent conflicts might be moments of larger developments, understanding that categories and concepts have histories, that how we think is shaped by when we think. These insights became permanent features of intellectual life. Hegel taught us that thought has a history. Before him, philosophers generally treated reason as timeless, as if the categories we use to think were given once and for all. Hegel showed that concepts develop, that what counts as rational changes, that understanding itself transforms over time. This historicizing of reason was genuinely revolutionary. It meant that philosophy couldn't proceed by simply analyzing eternal concepts. It had to understand how those concepts emerged, what problems they addressed, how they might be superseded. This approach spread everywhere. Historians stopped treating the past as a collection of facts and started looking for developmental patterns. Anthropologists stopped judging other cultures by supposedly universal standards and started understanding them on their own terms. Even scientists, when reflecting philosophically on their work, recognized that scientific concepts evolve, that paradigms shift, that what counts as explanation changes. The shadow Hegel cast was long precisely because he operated at such a fundamental level. He wasn't just proposing theories within philosophy, he was changing what philosophy could be, how it could proceed, what questions it could ask. After Hegel, you couldn't pretend that your philosophical position was simply the truth, obvious to any rational mind. You had to acknowledge that it was a position shaped by particular historical circumstances, addressing particular problems, potentially subject to development or replacement. This created a permanent crisis for philosophy. If all positions are historically conditioned, if every claim is relative to its context, how can philosophy make any claim to truth? Doesn't historicism lead to relativism? If concepts change, if rationality develops, what remains stable? What prevents philosophy from collapsing into mere history? These questions didn't paralyze Hegel's successors. They energized them. The realization that all thought is historically situated became the starting point for an explosion of new philosophical approaches. Some embraced the historicism fully. Others tried to find ways around it, but nobody could ignore it. The existentialists took Hegel's emphasis on concrete existence and radicalized it. Kierkegaard had already pointed the way. Heidegger pushed further. If all conceptual frameworks are historically contingent, then authenticity means confronting that contingency directly. You can't hide behind universal reason or eternal truths. You have to take responsibility for your own situated existence. Sartre made it explicit. Existence precedes essence. There's no human nature given in advance. We create ourselves through our choices. The burden of freedom is absolute, because there's no higher court of appeal. This was Hegel turned inside out. Where Hegel saw freedom realized through participation in rational institutions, Sartre saw freedom as radical individual responsibility that no institution could contain. The pragmatists found a different path. Dewey absorbed Hegel's critique of fixed categories, but rejected the system building. Ideas aren't representations of reality. They're tools for dealing with problems. Truth isn't correspondence to an eternal structure. It's what works in practice. This was Hegel's dynamism without his idealism. Concepts evolve not because spirit is unfolding, but because we're solving new problems. The test of a philosophical position isn't whether it captures reality correctly, but whether it helps us navigate experience successfully. Meanwhile, analytic philosophy emerged partly in reaction to Hegel. Russell and Moore wanted precision, clarity, logical rigor. The grand system building seemed like obscurantism. Philosophy should analyze concepts with the tools of formal logic, not spin dialectical webs. Yet even here, Hegel's influence persisted. Quine's attack on the analytic-synthetic distinction, his claim that no statement is immune to revision, that our conceptual scheme is interconnected and develops holistically, these are recognizably Hegelian themes translated into analytic vocabulary. Sellers's critique of the given, his insistence that perception is already conceptually structured, echoes Hegel's rejection of immediate knowledge. The Frankfurt School returned to Hegel explicitly. Adorno's negative dialectics took the dialectical method but refused the positive synthesis. Contradictions don't resolve, they persist. The task isn't to overcome them, but to hold them in tension, to resist the premature reconciliation that ideology offers. This was Hegel deployed against Hegel, using his own tools to question his conclusions. Habermas tried a different synthesis. He kept Hegel's emphasis on reason as a social achievement, but grounded it in communicative practice rather than absolute knowing. Rationality emerges from dialogue, from the give and take of reasons, in communities committed to understanding each other. The standard isn't spirit coming to self-knowledge, but mutual recognition achieved through conversation. Post-structuralism took the historicist insight to its limit. Foucault showed how even the most basic categories, truth, madness, sexuality, are historically constructed and serve relations of power. Derrida demonstrated how philosophical texts undermine their own claims to presence and stability. Every attempt to ground meaning leads to deferral. Every foundation turns out to be another interpretation. These weren't rejections of Hegel so much as radicalizations. If concepts have histories, if contradictions drive development, if nothing is simply present and self-identical, then why stop where Hegel stopped? Why assume the process culminates in absolute knowing? Why not embrace the endless play of difference? The curious thing is how Hegel survived all these appropriations and critiques. His specific doctrines were rejected. His system was dismantled. His conclusions were questioned. Yet the sensibility remained indispensable. Thinking about development, attending to contradictions, refusing simple oppositions, understanding context and history, these became standard moves. You might not call yourself a Hegelian. You might explicitly reject his idealism. But if you're doing serious intellectual work in the modern world, you're probably thinking in ways that Hegel made possible. Consider how we approach social criticism now. We don't just condemn institutions as good or bad. We ask how they developed, what functions they serve, what contradictions they contain, how they might transform. This is Hegelian method applied without Hegelian metaphysics. Or take cultural studies. We don't treat art and literature as timeless expressions of universal truths. We analyze how they're embedded in historical contexts, how they both reflect and shape consciousness, how they participate in larger struggles for recognition and meaning. Hegel would recognize this approach, even if he'd reject many specific claims. The philosophy of science absorbed Hegelian insights through Kuhn. Scientific revolutions aren't just discoveries of pre-existing truths. They're transformations in how we conceive problems, what counts as an explanation, what questions we can ask. The shift from Ptolemaic to Copernican astronomy wasn't just correcting an error, it was reconceptualizing what astronomy was about. Paradigms develop, reach internal contradictions, and give way to new frameworks. This is dialectical development playing out in the history of science. Even cognitive science, the most resolutely naturalistic domain, encountered Hegelian themes. The realization that perception isn't passive reception, but active construction. That concepts shape what we can experience. That knowledge emerges through interaction between mind and world. These claims resonate with Hegel's critique of immediate knowledge. Nobody's claiming neurons implement the logic, but the basic insight that cognition is dynamic, developmental, and structured by concepts that themselves develop, that's recognizably Hegelian. The political sphere shows Hegel's continued relevance most clearly. Every debate about rights, recognition, and justice operates in his conceptual territory. When we argue about whether certain groups are denied proper recognition, when we analyze how institutions mediate individual freedom, when we discuss the relationship between universal principles and particular communities, we're working through problems Hegel formulated. The specific solutions he offered might not satisfy. His defense of monarchy seems quaint. His dismissal of democracy looks wrong. But the framework he established, understanding freedom as achieved through recognition in well-ordered institutions, remains the terrain on which political philosophy operates. The question of nationalism shows this particularly well. Hegel's emphasis on the nation-state as the vehicle of freedom has been both vindicated and condemned by history. The 20th century saw nationalism produce both liberation movements and genocides. Post-colonial thinkers had to confront this legacy. Fanon's analysis of how colonized peoples achieve recognition through struggle is deeply Hegelian. Said's account of how the West constructed the Orient as its other draws on Hegel's master-slave dialectic. Yet both criticized Hegel's Eurocentrism, his assumption that only European history manifested spirit's development. The framework was useful. The specific content needed radical revision. Feminist philosophy encountered similar tensions. Simone de Beauvoir used Hegel's concepts to analyze women's situation. The second sex is denied full recognition, treated as other rather than acknowledged as autonomous subject. This was Hegelian analysis applied to gender relations. But Hegel himself had relegated women to the family sphere, excluded them from full participation in civil society and the state. His theory of recognition apparently didn't extend to recognizing women as equals. Later feminists pushed further. If recognition is the key to freedom, if self-consciousness requires acknowledgement from others, then the traditional separation between public and private spheres needs rethinking. The personal is political becomes a Hegelian insight. The structures that shape domestic life aren't separate from questions of freedom and recognition. They're fundamental to them. Environmental philosophy found resources and problems in Hegel. His account of spirit externalizing itself in nature and then returning to itself seemed to reduce nature to mere raw material for human development. This appeared to justify exploitation. Yet his emphasis on interconnection, on understanding things through their relations rather than in isolation, offered tools for ecological thinking. The idea that we're part of larger systems that we must understand holistically has Hegelian resonances. Nature isn't just object standing opposed to subject, it's the context in which subjectivity emerges and which subjectivity must comprehend to be free. The digital age raised new Hegelian questions. Social media platforms create new forms of recognition and misrecognition. We construct identities through how others see us, through the acknowledgement or denial of our posts and profiles. This isn't mere vanity, it's the dialectic of recognition playing out through new technology. The struggle for visibility, for being heard, for having one's perspective acknowledged, these are recognizably Hegelian themes, even in spaces Hegel couldn't have imagined. Artificial intelligence poses philosophical problems that Hegel's framework helps illuminate. If consciousness emerges through development, if self-awareness requires recognition from others, what happens when we create entities that might deserve recognition? The question of machine consciousness isn't just about computational power. It's about whether artificial systems can participate in the dialectic of recognition, whether they can be acknowledged as subjects rather than mere objects. Hegel didn't anticipate AI, but his concepts provide vocabulary for discussing it. The global nature of contemporary life makes Hegel's vision of world history newly relevant and newly problematic. We're more interconnected than ever. Economic systems span the planet. Cultural influences flow across borders. Environmental challenges respect no boundaries. This looks like the realization of Hegel's world spirit, the development of genuinely universal institutions. Yet the specific form it's taking, dominated by capitalism, marked by vast inequalities, producing new forms of domination alongside new freedoms, doesn't match Hegel's optimistic teleology. We have integration without reconciliation. We have development without progress. The dialectic continues, but without guarantee of resolution. This brings us back to the fundamental tension. Hegel promised that contradictions would be overcome, that development led toward greater freedom and rationality, that history had direction and meaning. 2 centuries later, we're less confident. We've seen too much horror, too many reversals, too many ways that apparent progress conceals new forms of oppression. The 20th century's genocides, totalitarianisms, and ecological devastations don't fit neatly into narratives of spirit realizing itself. We can't share Hegel's confidence that reason governs the world, yet we can't abandon his insights, that consciousness develops, that contradictions drive change, that freedom requires recognition, that institutions shape possibilities for human flourishing, that concepts have histories, that thinking seriously means thinking about development and transformation. These remain indispensable. We've inherited Hegel's method while losing his faith. We're stuck with dialectical thinking, but without the guarantee of dialectical resolution. Perhaps that's the appropriate relationship to Hegel for our time. Not disciples accepting the system, not critics rejecting it wholesale, but thinkers engaging with the problems he identified, using the tools he developed, while remaining skeptical about his solutions. The questions he asked are still our questions. How does consciousness emerge? How is freedom possible? What makes a society rational? How should we understand historical change? We just can't accept his answers with the confidence he displayed. This ambivalent inheritance defines contemporary philosophy's relationship to Hegel. He's inescapable, but unusable in his original form. The system is dead. The sensibility lives. We think with Hegel and against him simultaneously. Every attempt to move beyond him discovers that the terrain he mapped is still the landscape we're traversing. Every criticism of his conclusions employs concepts he developed. We're post-Hegelian in a way that keeps us permanently connected to Hegel. The very attempt to overcome him demonstrates his continuing relevance. The shadow's reach extends into unexpected corners of contemporary life. Consider how we talk about personal growth, the language of self-development, of becoming your authentic self, of overcoming internal contradictions to achieve integration. This is Hegelian vocabulary, secularized and individualized. Every self-help book promising transformation through confronting your inner conflicts is trafficking in dialectical logic, even when the authors have never heard of Hegel. The therapeutic culture that dominates modern psychology operates on implicitly Hegelian assumptions. The self isn't static but developing. Problems arise from contradictions between different aspects of personality. Resolution comes through synthesis, through integrating conflicting elements into a more comprehensive whole. The very concept of psychological maturity as a developmental process moving toward greater self-awareness and autonomy, this framework descends directly from Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, filtered through generations of psychologists who may not recognize the source. Corporate management theory absorbed Hegelian structures without acknowledgement. The emphasis on organizational development, on moving through stages of increasing sophistication, on resolving conflicts between departments or perspectives to achieve higher synthesis, all of this reflects dialectical thinking applied to business. When consultants talk about thesis, antithesis, synthesis in strategic planning, they're often unaware they're invoking a philosopher who died before the modern corporation existed. Educational philosophy carries Hegel's marks everywhere. The idea that learning proceeds through developmental stages, that students must actively construct knowledge rather than passively receive it, that education should cultivate critical thinking by exposing students to conflicting perspectives. These principles dominate progressive pedagogy. John Dewey, the most influential American educational philosopher, was deeply influenced by Hegel. The entire tradition of developmental psychology in education, from Piaget onward, operates within broadly Hegelian parameters, even when explicitly rejecting his idealism. Technology companies building artificial intelligence systems are wrestling with Hegelian problems, whether they realize it or not. The question of how machine learning models develop more sophisticated capabilities through exposure to contradictory data, how they integrate conflicting information to produce more nuanced outputs, how they might progress towards something resembling genuine understanding. These are dialectical questions. The debate about whether AI could achieve consciousness necessarily involves Hegelian concepts about what consciousness requires. Self-awareness, Hegel argued, emerges through development and recognition. If we build systems that develop and interact, do they become candidates for consciousness? The philosophical framework for even asking that question comes significantly from Hegel. Social media platforms are laboratories for Hegelian dynamics of recognition, taken to pathological extremes. The hunger for likes, shares, validation from others. This reflects the deep human need for recognition that Hegel identified as central to consciousness. But the recognition available through social media is often shallow, quantified, addictive. It provides a simulacrum of the mutual acknowledgement that Hegel saw as necessary for genuine self-consciousness. The result is a strange parody of Hegelian recognition, endless pursuit of acknowledgement that never quite satisfies because it lacks the depth and reciprocity that real recognition requires. Political polarization demonstrates dialectical processes without dialectical resolution. Opposing perspectives clash, contradictions intensify, but instead of synthesis emerging, the conflict simply escalates. Each side becomes more entrenched in its position, more convinced of its righteousness, more unable to recognize the partial truth in opposing views. This is dialectic stuck, unable to progress to higher unity. Hegel assumed that rational discussion would eventually produce synthesis. Our experience suggests that sometimes contradictions just harden into permanent opposition. That development can stall, that not all conflicts resolve themselves into higher truth. Environmental philosophy grapples with problems Hegel couldn't have anticipated, but his framework helps illuminate. The relationship between humanity and nature, between our self-conscious development and the ecosystems we depend on, this involves dialectical tensions. We emerged from nature, yet stand apart from it. Our freedom requires dominating natural forces, yet our survival depends on recognizing our embeddedness in natural systems. The ecological crisis represents a contradiction that demands resolution, a clash between developmental trajectories that cannot both continue unchanged. Hegel's dialectical method helps analyze this situation, even though his specific conclusions about humanity's relationship to nature now seem problematic. The critique of capitalism, Marx developed using Hegelian tools, remains indispensable for understanding contemporary economic systems. Capitalism generates constant development through its internal contradictions. Competition drives innovation. The pursuit of profit creates new technologies, new forms of organization, new possibilities. Yet this same process produces inequality, instability, exploitation, environmental destruction. The system develops, but the development contains destructive elements that threaten to undermine the system itself. This is dialectical analysis at its most powerful, revealing how progress and crisis emerge from the same underlying dynamics. Yet Marx's confidence that capitalism's contradictions would necessarily lead to socialist revolution has proven unfounded. The dialectic doesn't guarantee any particular outcome. Capitalism adapts, absorbs opposition, transforms itself while preserving core structures. The contradictions persist, but don't resolve in the way Marx predicted. We're left with analytical tools that reveal problems, but don't guarantee solutions, that show us the contradictions without assuring us they'll be overcome. Contemporary art struggles with Hegelian legacies. The idea that art history develops through dialectical stages, that each movement negates and transcends what came before, that we're progressing towards some end of art. This narrative shaped modernist aesthetics, but postmodernism rejected such teleological thinking. Instead of development toward truth, endless play of styles without progress. Instead of synthesis, fragmentation, and irony. Yet even this rejection operates within parameters Hegel established. The very concept of art history as having a development we can narrate and critique, this framework persists even when specific narratives are rejected. Music theory absorbed Hegelian structures in ways that continue shaping how we think about composition. The idea that a piece of music should develop themes dialectically, introducing material, creating conflict through variation or contrasting themes, then resolving tensions in a synthesis that brings the piece to completion. This describes sonata form as understood through Hegelian lenses. Not every musical tradition operates this way, but Western classical music and its descendants remain deeply marked by assumptions about development, conflict, and resolution that reflect dialectical thinking about how meaningful structure unfolds in time. Architecture confronts Hegelian questions about how space shapes consciousness and social relations. Buildings aren't just shelter. They organize experience, facilitate certain activities while inhibiting others, embody values in concrete form. The design of cities, of public spaces, of institutions like schools or hospitals, these decisions have phenomenological implications. They structure how people encounter each other and themselves. Hegel understood that consciousness doesn't develop in a vacuum, but through engagement with material and social worlds. Architecture provides the stage where that development occurs, and thinking seriously about architectural choices requires attending to these phenomenological dimensions. Legal theory operates within frameworks Hegel helped establish. The concept of rights as historically developing rather than eternally fixed. The idea that law should embody rational principles while adapting to changing circumstances. The emphasis on individual freedom requiring institutional support. These are Hegelian contributions to jurisprudence. Every contemporary debate about constitutional interpretation, about whether we should read laws as fixed documents or living instruments, about how to balance individual liberty with social order, these arguments employ conceptual tools Hegel developed, even when participants don't recognize the source. Medical ethics grapples with problems about personhood and recognition that Hegel's philosophy illuminates. When does consciousness emerge in fetal development? When does it irreversibly depart in dying patients? What obligations do we owe to beings with partial or potential consciousness? These questions require understanding consciousness as something that develops, rather than simply existing or not existing. Hegel's developmental account of self-awareness provides resources for thinking through such problems, even though his specific conclusions may not directly apply to medical contexts he couldn't have imagined. Disability studies challenges Hegelian assumptions while employing Hegelian methods. The traditional emphasis on development toward autonomy and rationality as the goal of human life marginalizes people with cognitive disabilities who may not fit that trajectory. This critique is important and necessary, yet the method of criticism often remains dialectical, showing how concepts of normalcy and disability depend on each other, revealing contradictions in our thinking about human value, pushing toward more inclusive syntheses that recognize diverse forms of flourishing. The tools Hegel developed get turned against conclusions his system seemed to support. The study of consciousness itself, as a scientific and philosophical problem, operates in Hegel's shadow. Contemporary neuroscience and philosophy of mind ask how subjective experience arises from physical processes. Hegel argued that consciousness emerges through development, through interaction with world and others, through progressively more sophisticated forms of self-relation. This developmental account contrasts with approaches that treat consciousness as a simple property that either exists or doesn't. The hard problem of consciousness, explaining how and why subjective experience exists at all, may require developmental and dialectical approaches that Hegel pioneered, even if we reject his idealist metaphysics. Globalization embodies contradictions that demand Hegelian analysis. Economic integration creates unprecedented prosperity while producing new forms of inequality. Cultural exchange enables mutual understanding while generating backlash and identity politics. Universal institutions like the United Nations or the International Criminal Court claim to represent humanity as a whole while remaining dominated by powerful nations. These contradictions aren't accidental features of globalization, but intrinsic to its structure. Understanding them requires dialectical thinking that can grasp how opposing tendencies emerge from the same processes. The concept of intersectionality in contemporary social theory is dialectical in structure, if not in explicit acknowledgement. The insight that different forms of oppression interact, that being a black woman involves more than simply adding racism and sexism together, that identities are constituted through multiple overlapping systems of power. This requires thinking about how contradictions compound and transform each other. Intersectional analysis shows how social categories develop through their relations to each other, how they can't be understood in isolation. This is Hegelian methodology applied to understanding systemic oppression. Climate change presents a crisis that Hegel's framework helps analyze, even though his conclusions about nature and history now seem inadequate. The contradiction between economic development and ecological sustainability can't be resolved by simply choosing one side. We need economies that support human flourishing, but we need them to operate within planetary boundaries. This demands synthesis, transformation of both economic systems and our relationship to natural world. The problem is genuinely dialectical, requiring us to overcome the opposition between development and sustainability rather than simply prioritizing one over the other. Yet Hegel's confidence that such syntheses will emerge, that history tends toward rational resolution of contradictions, this confidence we can't share. Climate change might not be resolved. The contradiction might intensify until systems collapse. The dialectic doesn't guarantee progress. It describes a method for analysing contradictions and imagining their potential resolution, but it doesn't ensure that resolution will actually occur. History might be dialectical without being progressive. This brings us back to the central tension in Hegel's legacy. His method remains indispensable. Thinking dialectically, attending to contradictions and development, recognizing how concepts and institutions shape possibilities for consciousness and freedom, these approaches continue illuminating contemporary problems. But his conclusions, his systematic confidence, his faith in reason's triumph, these we've lost. We're dialectical thinkers who doubt that dialectics guarantees anything. Perhaps this skeptical appropriation is the mature relationship to Hegel, not disciples accepting the system whole, not critics rejecting everything he offered, but thinkers who use his tools while questioning his faith, who learn from his method while abandoning his metaphysical confidence, who recognize his insights while rejecting his conclusions. We're post-Hegelian in a way that keeps us permanently engaged with Hegel, using his concepts to criticize his system, applying his method to undermine his results. The shadow lengthens still. 2 centuries after his death, we cannot think without him. Every attempt to move beyond Hegel discovers that the territory he mapped remains the landscape we're traversing. Every criticism employs concepts he developed. Every alternative philosophy positions itself in relation to problems he identified. We're trying to overcome Hegel using tools he gave us, which means we never quite escape. The very effort to surpass him demonstrates his continuing grip on how we think. The question then becomes what we do with this inheritance. If Hegel can't be fully accepted or completely rejected, if his method illuminates while his conclusions mislead, how should contemporary thought relate to his legacy? One approach is to treat Hegel as a resource rather than an authority, extracting useful concepts without buying the entire system. We might employ dialectical analysis of specific contradictions while rejecting the claim that history moves toward rational fulfillment. We might use his insights about recognition and self-consciousness without accepting that these culminate in absolute knowing. This pragmatic appropriation takes what works and leaves the rest. But something gets lost in this approach. Hegel's power came from systematic thinking, from showing how concepts connect and develop, from demonstrating that isolated insights gain meaning through their place in larger structures. When we pluck out useful bits while discarding the framework, we miss how the parts derive their significance from the whole. The danger is turning Hegel into a toolbox rather than engaging with the challenge his philosophy presents. The challenge of thinking systematically about totality, even when we doubt that totality can be grasped. Another approach treats Hegel as an opponent worth continuous engagement, someone whose errors remain productive because they illuminate what we're trying to move beyond. Reading Hegel becomes a way of clarifying our own commitments by seeing what we reject. His idealism helps define our materialism. His confidence about progress clarifies our skepticism. His systematic ambitions reveal our anti-systematic sensibilities. This adversarial relationship keeps Hegel relevant by making him the foil against which contemporary thought defines itself. Yet this too seems inadequate. Treating Hegel purely as opponent misses how his questions remain our questions even when his answers fail. The problems he identified about freedom, history, consciousness, recognition, these aren't problems he invented, but fundamental tensions he articulated with unprecedented clarity. We can reject his solutions while acknowledging that he saw the problems more clearly than most philosophers before or since. The relationship isn't simply adversarial, but involves recognizing a shared set of concerns. Perhaps the most honest approach is accepting that our relationship to Hegel will remain unresolved, that we're permanently caught between appropriation and critique, between using his concepts and questioning his conclusions. This isn't a failure to achieve proper distance or correct interpretation. It's the condition of post-Hegelian thought, the state of being unable to think without him, while being unable to think with him completely. The ambivalence isn't a problem to be solved, but the structure of how his legacy operates. This ambivalent inheritance shapes contemporary philosophy in ways both obvious and subtle. When political theorists analyze how institutions shape consciousness, when social critics examine contradictions within capitalism, when ethicists explore recognition and identity, when philosophers of history question progress narratives while acknowledging that history has directions and patterns, they're working through problems Hegel defined. The vocabulary changes, the conclusions differ, but the terrain remains recognizably Hegelian. Consider debates about artificial intelligence and consciousness. When we ask whether machines could develop self-awareness, we're asking Hegelian questions about the relationship between subjective experience and objective processes, about whether consciousness requires recognizing itself in its other, about what conditions make self-consciousness possible. Hegel didn't anticipate AI, but his framework for thinking about consciousness provides concepts that contemporary philosophy deploys in addressing these questions. The very idea that consciousness might emerge from complex systems interacting with themselves reflects dialectical patterns of thought. Or consider discussions about post-truth politics and epistemic crisis. When we worry that shared reality is fragmenting, that different communities inhabit different factual worlds, we're confronting problems about the social constitution of truth that Hegel explored. His insight that truth isn't simply individual belief, but requires social validation, that what counts as knowledge depends on frameworks of recognition and justification. This remains central to understanding how epistemic norms can break down. We're living through a crisis that Hegel's concepts help analyze, even though he couldn't have imagined social media or algorithmic curation. The pandemic revealed dialectical patterns in stark form. The opposition between individual freedom and collective responsibility, between economic activity and public health, between local autonomy and global coordination. These contradictions couldn't be resolved by simply choosing one side. Every attempt to prioritize economy over health or health over economy crashed against the fact that neither can be secured without attention to the other. The pandemic demanded thinking dialectically about how opposing needs interrelate, though this didn't guarantee that societies would achieve genuine synthesis rather than simply oscillating between failed one-sided responses. These contemporary applications suggest that Hegel's method has staying power even as his system crumbles. The dialectical approach, the attention to contradiction and development, the recognition that concepts and institutions mutually constitute each other, these remain useful for analyzing problems Hegel never encountered. But we deploy these tools without his confidence that contradictions will resolve toward rational outcomes. We're dialectical pessimists or dialectical agnostics, using his method while doubting his metaphysics. This brings us to perhaps the deepest question about Hegel's legacy. Can dialectical thinking survive the death of dialectical faith? Can the method work without the system? Hegel believed they were inseparable, that dialectical logic revealed the structure of reality itself, that method and metaphysics formed a unity. If we accept the method while rejecting the metaphysics, are we fundamentally misunderstanding what dialectics means? Or have we discovered that his tool works better than his theory explains? The answer may be that dialectical thinking always involved more skepticism than Hegel admitted. When we read the phenomenology carefully, we notice moments where the promised synthesis fails to arrive, where contradictions persist rather than resolve, where development moves sideways or circles back rather than progressing forward. The actual arguments are often more ambiguous than the systematic framework suggests. Perhaps Hegel, the dialectical thinker, was always in tension with Hegel, the systematic philosopher, and later readers are simply making explicit a tension that was there from the beginning. This reading suggests that Hegel's legacy consists partly in having created a tradition of thinkers who use his method to undermine his conclusions. Every major post-Hegelian philosopher, from Marx through Adorno to contemporary critical theorists, has operated this way, employing dialectical analysis while rejecting systematic closure. This isn't betrayal of Hegel, but fulfillment of what his method makes possible once freed from his metaphysical commitments. The tradition he founded is a tradition of self-criticism, of thought that questions its own foundations, and this means that authentic Hegelianism might require moving beyond Hegel. Yet the question nags. If we reject his metaphysics, his confidence in reason, his faith in historical progress, what makes our thinking Hegelian rather than simply eclectic? Why call it dialectical rather than just careful attention to complexity and contradiction? The answer may be that Hegel permanently changed how we understand these basic categories. After Hegel, contradiction isn't simply logical error, but potential source of development. Complexity isn't just multiplicity, but structured patterns of opposition and relation.